Hi everyone, this is your 5-minute notice. We will be starting the webinar shortly at 10 o'clock. All right, everyone, welcome to today's webinar on social emotional learning as a pathway to equity. We're so thrilled to have you with us today. My name is Rachel Escobedo. I am the online ambassador for Sanford Programs, and I will be your moderator today. Our speaker is Doug Fisher. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Doug Fisher. Doug Fisher is professor of educational leadership at San Diego State University and a teacher leader at Health Sciences High and Middle College, having been an early intervention teacher and elementary school educator. He is a recipient of an International Reading Association William S. Gray Citation of Merit, an Exemplary Leader Award from the Conference on English Leadership of NCTE, as well as a Krista McAuliffe Award for Excellence in Teacher Education. He has published numerous articles on reading and literacy, differentiated instruction, and curriculum design, as well as books such as Visible Learning for Literacy, Building Equity, and Assessment Capable Learners. And we will share how you can get in touch with him later. Before I actually welcome Doug, I also meant to include some ground rules. If any of you have questions for our speaker, please be sure to include them in the chat box and we will hold questions until later. Also, as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll have access to the recording later. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our amazing speaker, Doug Fisher.
Hello, thank you. I appreciate that introduction. No pressure there, Rachel, for describing me as amazing. Thank you. So I'm excited to talk about this. This is some of our more current work about how we think about equity and the role that social and emotional learning plays in equity. And before I start with that, I thought we should take a poll for me to know who all's here. So I'm interested in your role.
Awesome. So a poll is going to launch on your screen, and we'd like to know if you're an administrator, teacher, community leader, or other. And if you are other, please submit your response via chat. We'll give you guys all 45 seconds to get your answers in. All right, we'll give you guys, looks like you're still getting your responses in, like 10 more seconds. And then we'll look at our results. All right, thank you so much, everybody, for your responses. Let's look at the results.
Look at all the others we've gotten here.
Yes.
Better look at the chat. Maybe we see directors and curriculum people.
Yeah, so I'll read a couple of these out loud. We're getting a lot of school counselors, a lot of counselors, some program directors, coordinator of curriculum, let's see, communities and schools, director of community and family liaison. Let's see, Couple more. I am an administrator for my organization, but also a community leader through my Optimist group and after school advocacy group. We have public health advocacy organization. All right. Thank you so much for your responses, everybody.
Thank you. So I guess I assume you all know that equality and equity are not the same thing. And we say this a lot. I hear this a lot. There's a difference between equality and equity. But then I struggle as people try to implement it, because most of the time in schools, we get to the point where we want everything to be the same for our students. We want the same grading policies. We want the same discipline consequences. So we really haven't embraced this as there's a difference. So I Googled this to see how the world was thinking about equality and equity, and I found this picture, and I thought, yes, that's how a lot of people think about equity, is rearranging the existing resources to make some kids have access to which they didn't before. And I think there's a certain amount of that kind of equity happening, but the reality is we struggle with rearranging resources. The reality often looks like this, and people don't like to talk about that reality, that some kids get richer and richer and richer, and some aren't. And then this one, I think, is the more current version of that. And there's this idea of liberation, of removing the fence. And I appreciated this when it came out, and I thought, yeah, that's what we're looking for. But then I started thinking, those kids are still not able to play the game, and they're still not in the stands with everyone else. So I think about that a lot. Is this what we're really trying to accomplish? Is this what we mean by equity in this version of liberation? And I thought that was what my problem was with this image. But I've been thinking about that even further, and I'm thinking that my problem with this image is not only that they never got to play the game, but it's also that we're thinking that equity is about physical, biological differences. And there is a need to address some of that. Yes, if you can't see over the fence, we should figure out how to do that. But I don't know that the only differences we're trying to address are biological or physical in nature. I think that conversation might perpetuate a dangerous narrative that racial equity is helping people of color and communities of color because we are inherently and biologically different. So I've been thinking a lot about this, about what we mean by this idea of equity. And as we know, race has no deterministic, biologic basis, and yet at the same time, race is so powerful that it can have life or death consequences. And as I thought about that, I thought about the quote from our Supreme Court, and I'll give you a second to read this. So I think there are some interesting thoughts in here about the role that race plays in our society and how we as school people might help address this issue that has confronted our country for decades and decades. And why this matters to me when I think about this, equity has real consequences in the classroom on a regular basis. And I was having a conversation with Glenn Singleton, and he was talking about his work on courageous conversations and looking at his application to literacy. And one of the things we talked about was that students of color do not have the same opportunities to choose what they want to read as white students, that there's less choice when you are in certain demographic groups. Students of color do not have the same access to the quantity, quality, or variety of books as most white students. Students of color do not have the same opportunities for deep intellectual discussion around text as white students, and many students of color do not see themselves as readers and have not been told the power there is in reading. That's just one content example of how this inequity plays out in our classrooms. And I don't think we all have reached a definition of what we mean by equity. And I still go places where, in reality, they're talking about equality. So our definition, we've worked very hard in San Diego. Our definition, working with our partners at San Diego State and our partners in the school system, we have a definition of what we're looking for with equity. So I'm going to share it with you and see how you think about this, and then we'll spend a little bit of time in the chat. We recognize that every student has a unique identity profile, and that profile has far too often been impacted by racism, bias, and bigotry. And when we look at identity, we adopted the Allegheny County in Pennsylvania view of what is your identity. And your identity is a constellation of many experiences you have in the world. And as we've been doing this work, we appreciate this version. This is how we think about identity. But we're also noticing that things like adverse childhood events and traumatic experiences was not included on here. And that is also part of your identity as well. That equity also occurs as a result of sensitive, courageous conversations and actions. And that equity requires the distribution and redistribution of resources and initiatives based on individual and group needs, derived from multiple sources of qualitative and quantitative data, and that equity leads to engaged, inspired, and successful learners. So it's a bit of a long definition, but we tried to capture our belief systems here about why we were trying to do this work in equity. And as I hope to show soon, social emotional learning helps facilitate equity. So I'm interested in some comments in the chat box, your reactions, your thoughts to maybe the first time you've seen this definition of equity coming out of San Diego. You can ask me clarifying questions here. You can criticize, commend, alternatives, etc.
Thank you, Doug. And as a reminder, your chat box is located on your control panel. So yes, if you have any responses to Doug and how he's defined equity and how maybe you define equity or equality, please go ahead and submit them. And we'll read them out loud.
Nobody wants to talk, Rachel?
Oh yes, they are coming in. See, one question is, how do we recognize and learn about everyone's many identities?
Awesome. So in part, that comes with our relationships with students. In part, that comes with students choosing to disclose things about themselves through their writing and through their interactions with others. And some things are private that students don't want to share yet about their identity profile. In some schools, unfortunately, people say that doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with my role in teaching them algebra, say. And we have to get to the point where our educators understand their role is to know who their learners are and what their learners still need to learn. And your unique identity profile influences the way you see the world. And that profile is often impacted by discrimination. So yes, I'm not saying it's easy to realize the actions taken required in this equity statement, and understanding the other and how that identity formed and the experiences that student had is an important part of being a teacher and providing, or counselor or school leader, and providing students opportunities in the curriculum to share their thinking and informed by their experiences. We're going to look at some of the meetup and buddy up experiences that Sanford Harmony has put together. In many of those situations, students are able to disclose things about themselves and talk about where it came from, and it helps the peers and the teacher understand that unique identity profile.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, we have a number of questions that just come in. So another person's asking, wouldn't socioeconomic status impact as much as race?
It does. we're talking about race specifically here in my time with you. Socioeconomic certainly impacts race, and there's an overlap, a significant correlation between socioeconomic and race. The difference here, though, is around the blatant discrimination and bigotry that happens because of your ethnicity and your race. And we don't see that as blatantly when kids live in poverty. We might have low expectations for students who live in poverty, making excuses of why they can't achieve. But there seems to be less institutionalized racism and those kinds of barriers for students. And if you think about all the different ways that your identity is formed, your relationship, your education levels, all those kinds of things influence who you are and your identity profile.
Thank you, Doug. All right. Next question is, I think this is actually more of a comment. This person says, I think that the absence of geographic/environmental factors in our identity model makes it incomplete. And then another comment. Thank you for having so many, I'm not sure what's, so many due to gender, sex on here. I feel like in school we often ignore those, especially in primary.
Totally agree. Scary to talk about gender, all that stuff when you're in the primary. It's a lot scary for a lot of people.
Another question, what are some good first steps to addressing varying degrees of bias?
We're gonna spend a little bit of time on that, but not a lot. I would turn to some courageous conversations kind of stuff and some cultural proficiency work for addressing those kinds of bias.
Perfect. Could you define your intention of resources, perhaps outside of what comes top to mind? And then in parentheses, she wrote money.
Money. I love money. Money's a good one. Allocate money to kids who need it. I totally agree with that. The other resources I think about are like staff time. Where do people spend their energy? I think about the kind of like the access to materials. I was thinking about peers, the kinds of worksheets some kids get and the kinds of rich tasks other kids get. There's all kinds of ways that when you think about all the different resources that either students get or don't get. I think I do think money is a big one, though. I keep reflecting on that as I'm saying it. We should allocate and reallocate funding, but we also have to allocate our time and our attention and our passion and our materials.
All right. Thank you, Doug. Let's see. Another comment. I love this definition, and I love that you are taking the time to differentiate between equality and equity.
Thank you.
Another question. Where do we begin addressing institutionalized inequities at a site level?
I'm going to show you an equity, a tool, a framework, I guess, and there is a tool that goes with it. We can email afterwards about an equity audit that we've developed based on this taxonomy. So to me, that's a good segue for me to introduce our next part of our work. So I'm pause there, Rachel. There may be some more questions. We'll come back to them if that's okay with you.
That's fine. Thank you, Doug.
Great. So I think one of the things we have to do is help everybody come to a definition of equity. It does not have to be our definition of equity, but people should have their definition of equity. That was a struggle for us to come to terms as a large group of what we meant by equity. And then we had to say, what's our North Star? Because a lot of people only cared about academic achievement as their North Star, as the outcome of equity. And we said that's not sufficient. Our North Star is about getting kids inspired, successful, engaged. That's what we're trying to accomplish. That's our North Star. So then we've built this taxonomy. I'll start at the bottom of what we're thinking about. To build equity, and then there's a audit tool that goes along with this if people want it. It starts with physical integration. Do kids have access to environments where other kids are? Then we build social emotional engagement and learning. We provide opportunities for learning. We have amazing instructional experiences for them, and they become engaged, inspired, successful learners. And if any one of these levels is missing, we're going to compromise our equity ability to deliver. We have a promise of delivering on equity, and when we miss any of these, we're going to see gaps in students being successful, engaged, and inspired. These are often together taken as an output of achievement and attendance and discipline and those kinds of things. That's the output side. The input side, what we do in systems, whether they're schools or communities or whatever, is to think about these 5 ways, these 5 systems that build on each other. We'll start with engaged, inspired, and successful learners. We want students to say things like, I am proud of myself. I like who I am. I can look in the mirror and smile at who I see. School is helping me discover what life's all about. School is a place that is helping me plan my future. That's our goal, that's our aspiration, that our students have it in them to say these kinds of things, to be inspired, to be engaged, and to learn at high levels. To get there, they need to experience instructional excellence. And I'm going to talk briefly about a kindergarten math study. The 4 kindergarten types of classrooms, a large study. I didn't put the numbers up there. It's a large study. I'll come back to the numbers in a second. Oops, jumping around. Let's say this one teacher, one type of teacher, we'll call her Miss Campbell. She has whole group instruction and small group learning. English learners are in a permanent homogeneous group, quote, so I can give them specialized instruction. That's one type. The second type teacher, we'll call him Mr. Andrews, has whole group instruction with heterogeneous small group, so a single English learner in each group, so these kids get exposure to native English speakers. Another teacher, we'll call her Miss Barnett, uses whole group instruction with both homogeneous and heterogeneous small groups. Quote, I give specialized supports like teaching academic language structures, but other times they benefit from being with more native speakers, etc. And the last, we'll call her Miss Dennison, uses whole group instruction only. That's what I've always taught. I'm not going to change it now. So in a study of 3,748 kindergarten English learners, the achievement was based on 2 factors. Number 1, the teacher's perceptions of the student's math ability, and number 2, how they were grouped in the classroom. Whole group did not work, and that first practice of segregating those kids did not work. Teachers, from the time those kids enter school, have a profound influence on whether or not kids actually learn. So we're not blaming the English learners. It's the way we structure those experiences for them that either gets them to learn at high levels or not. And as I think about that, grouping we could certainly talk about, and the value of grouping and the ways to group, but I want to hit on perceptions a little bit more. Perceptions are powerful. They are a very powerful way that we think about the world, and they influence what how we act in the world. I'll give you an example. A couple years ago, I was talking to a superintendent, and I really wanted to do some work on teacher perceptions about their students. And the superintendent said, no, I didn't hire that. I didn't hire you for that. I hired you to do Make It, Take It workshop on close reading. And I was trying, oh, please. And I was reading this book at the time. It was about this company called Colgate, and they were inventing new products. And one of the products they tried out was portable dental floss. I promise I'm going somewhere with this. It's portable dental floss, and it didn't sell very well. Nobody seemed to want to buy portable dental floss. They didn't carry dental floss around with them. So it didn't sell very well. And they had to come up with a new marketing campaign to change the perception of people so they would buy this product. And here's one of the pictures. Look, you have this brown stuff in your mouth. It's super gross. You need our product. Or you have this red thing in your mouth. It's gross. You need our product. Or you have this green in your mouth. There's probably spinach. You need our product. And it was really effective. It changed our perception, and they've made millions and millions of dollars on this portable dental floss device over the last 15 years. I suspect many of you right now are checking your teeth because we have been socialized to notice this now. But I want to ask you something. How many fingers does she have? It's the exact same photograph, and you might have missed that. It's called the priming effect. I primed you by telling you a story, and so you paid attention to things that were consistent with that story, and you missed some obvious other things. I believe that's happening all over in our classrooms, is our perceptions influence how we think about our students, their achievement, and their success. Where's that hand coming from? She must be super good at yoga, and his ear is missing. Now you see they're blatantly obvious missing, but the priming effect is powerful. We all are primed, all of us. It's unavoidable, but it's learning to recognize that, to learn to recognize our perceptions and how our perceptions might be faulty that helps us build on equity. See, I believe teachers' perceptions become students' reality. If I don't believe you can learn at a high level, you won't. If I don't believe I have the power to teach you at a high level, you won't learn at a high level. Perceptions become reality. And I think that's that instructional excellence. If I believe you have the power to learn and I make sure you have amazing experiences, you probably will. And that's part of the equity promise. Another area is the opportunity to learn. Getting access to the curriculum, getting access to things like AP classes, getting access to other courses, getting the support you need to be successful in those. It's not just about having amazing experiences educationally. It's also about making sure that we have some prerequisite things in place, some supports and systems and scaffolds in place to ensure that when kids are in those environments, they can learn at high levels. One of the superintendents here in San Diego says this all the time: equity lives in the master schedule. One of the assignments I give my graduate students is to get the master schedule at their school and do an equity audit on the master schedule. Who gets access to which kinds of learning experiences and who does not? I put this example in because it specifically says related arts. They have pride time with the social emotional learning. And if you go to some schools, you won't see that, because equity lives in the master schedule. And all of us should learn to analyze our master schedule to say, why are the boys in this class and the girls in this class? Why are some kids with disabilities in that and not in that? What about kids who are African American, Black in this and not in that? We need to learn how to analyze our master schedule, because it's showing the opportunities we provide kids to learn. But why you're probably here is around the social emotional learning. The big ideas here around how we build the healthy social learning experiences for students. We've taken a bit broader view of social emotional learning that includes things like cultural proficiency at the organization level and at the individual level. So I know lots of social emotional learning programs are focused on the individual student, and we're thinking about the proficiency of the school. Do we recognize and understand other cultures? Do we create a welcoming environment? Are we focused on the relationships we have with students, we have with each other, and that students have with one another? Are we intentionally inviting, which I will come back to, and do we engage in restorative practices? Do we help students repair the harm that they do to the relationships when they misbehave? Those are big ideas that we've been pushing on for broadening the lens of social emotional learning. This is our current SEL view, Nancy Fry, Dominique Smith, and I. This is how we've been thinking about social emotional learning. It differs from a few of the others, although you'll see commonalities. So we've read a lot of people's work around social emotional learning, and we're trying to put it into practice here in our community. And part of what we need to do is build students' agency and identity. So they recognize their strengths, they know how to persevere, they understand there are times to exhibit a growth mindset, they recognize their triggers out of a growth mindset into a more fixed mindset, We want to be careful that growth and fixed are not dichotomies. We all use both growth and fixed. We understand which triggers us, those kinds of things. We also teach students emotional regulation, how to have impulse control and delay gratification and cope with stressful environments. Emotional regulation is a really important part of SEL. And I like to say it this way: I don't know a teacher in the world who wouldn't like it if his or her students didn't have better emotional regulation. That is a worthy goal for all of us. The third area we think about is the cognitive regulation, moving beyond an isolated set of skills, but thinking about your thinking and metacognition, choosing when you pay attention, setting goals, figuring out problems, seeking help from others. These are really good skills in how we regulate our academic cognitive development. The fourth area we think about are social skills and relationships. How do we teach students to build relationships with one another? How do they repair those relationships when they're damaged? As part of that, communication, empathy, sharing, teamwork, pro-social skills, those are all important parts of creating a classroom community where people are not getting bullied and they're not missing school because they're scared and they're not shutting down and not learning because they're being teased or whatever. And then probably the one that's most different from other SEL models, we call public spirit. And it's moving social emotional learning out of focused on the individual kid to getting the student to engage in the broader community, having civic responsibility, seeking out social justice, engaging in service learning, becoming a leader at the school, the classroom. We're thinking that social emotional learning cannot only be about the individual growth that a young person needs to do across his or her life to adjust socially and emotionally. We're now saying all learning is social and emotional. Every learning opportunity we get should include these things. If I choose a text, a book to read with my students, that character is probably going to engage in some sort of social skills, maybe emotional regulation. The character probably will have some identity and agency things. I should call that out when I'm sharing a text with students. When I'm watching students interact with one another, when I choose a math problem, when I'm sitting one-on-one talking to a student about a situation, I'm thinking about the agency I'm developing with those students. I'm thinking about their regulation, cognitive and emotional. I'm thinking about their social skills, and I'm thinking about how they repair relationships. It's becoming a way of thinking that every time we teach, whether it's fourth graders, kindergartners, or calculus, every time we teach, we recognize opportunities to address these 5 things inside the curriculum. I also believe there are some added, some unique social emotional skills programs that are very beneficial for kids. But when I read the meta-analyses on this, it's pretty clear to me that if we're going to have success with social emotional learning, it has to be integrated into the entire learning experience day of that student. Now, at our school, we're using Sanford Harmony's, some of the tools from Sanford Harmony, but I work at a secondary school, and these were not really designed for a secondary, they're really designed for elementary, but they work spectacularly well. We are working to get kids to understand their emotions, name their emotions, and then address them, that there's no bad place, right? It's understanding this is what's happening to me, how do I regulate that? Before I talk more about Sanford Harmony, there's this kind of teaching. This is Walter Perky's work. And he says there are some teachers, I'll start up in the red quadrant, there are some teachers who are intentionally uninviting. They are uninviting to their students, and they mean to be. They choose to be harsh and vindictive and alienating. And these folks are very hard to change because that is their personality. And then in the purple, there are some people who are unintentionally uninviting. They're still uninviting. The kids don't like them. They're not good relationships. They don't develop social emotional connections with students, but they didn't mean to be. And these people with some coaching can become more intentional. They can become less uninviting and more intentional about it. It's recognizing these behaviors and calling people out in a private, growth-producing way, not in a big public way, that helps them move out of being unintentionally uninviting. And then in the blue area, there are some teachers who are unintentionally inviting. They're happy, they're energetic, there's piles of energy in their classroom, super enthusiastic, but it's just not consistent, and it's not resulting in great learning and relationships with students. And it might even be anything goes, I'm so happy all the time. If you misbehave, it's fine. If you're rude to somebody else, it's fine. Where we want to get to the point is that teachers are intentionally inviting. And I know this is hard to give teachers feedback and coach them on how inviting they are with their students. Most of us would be happy to coach a teacher on how to do a read aloud, or how to do reciprocal teaching, or how to model thinking during mathematics. We're very comfortable modeling strategies. We're less comfortable giving feedback on whether or not the teacher is being inviting. But the classroom should be intentionally inviting. Purposeful actions by the adult that are consistently positive, that communicate growth, that are purposeful and sensitive to the needs. And I think we have to grow some thicker skin and be able to say to people in growth-producing ways that are kind and humane, you're currently being uninviting to your students, and we need to fix that. So Harmony cards have helped us do this. This is a meetup. For us, the meetup is the whole class. They are having some discussions about some things that are going on, and we often end with one of the cards. We spend time with students getting to know each other, and the teachers getting to know them, because there are interesting, cool things to talk about on these cards. And some of the students in the beginning are uncomfortable talking about their favorite food, or some of the lower level ones, but the card says so, so they do it. And they create this environment, this climate, this culture of trust and relationships. Students spend time thinking about what's on the card, they talk about it, they might write about it. We do a fair amount of time each day focused in our classrooms on helping students understand that social is as important as academics. This is a whole group meetup, as you can see. Some of them are more buddy up. They're one-on-one conversations with the topics. And we end up with some sort of closure activity each day that goes around the room. It can be high fives, it can be fist bumps, it can be whatever. It can be a word. It's building this climate in our schools that students understand that their emotional lives are valued as well. The last level of the taxonomy, which I'm not spending a lot of time on, is around physical integration. We've had a long history in this country of physical integration, not always with great success, because in part, we only did physical integration. We didn't do all the rest of this. But I do think physical integration is a prerequisite to the other things. If you have a segregated class, it's hard to feel valued, it's hard to feel connected, it's hard to feel those relationships. So I'm going to pause there and ask some more question and answer if things are on your mind that you want to talk to me about.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was a wonderful presentation. You gave us so much to think about and really, I don't know, mull over for the next day or so. I'm actually going to go, if you don't mind. There were a number of questions that we didn't get to when you stopped for a Q&A. I'm just going to dive into those. But now, if anyone continues to have more questions for Doug, please put your questions into the chat box or the questions box right now, and we will read them out loud. Okay. So one of the questions before was, what can we do when parents take advantage of that profile, such as economic status?
Yeah. Probably some private conversations with parents. And then when the parent's gone, we still have to teach their kid. And we have to make decisions on what that kid needs, what they're going to do to be able to learn. And I think a lot of people do end up taking advantage of status because they don't know what else to do. And I think I try to remember this parent is advocating for his or her child the best way they currently know how to do that. And maybe I need to do some reframing. Maybe I need to do some recasting of their conversation. And sometimes I just need to listen and then go about figuring out what's best for that kid. I don't have a great answer for that. I recognize that it is a challenge.
Thank you, Doug. All right, another question from before was, how do we get others to really recognize that there are true inequities that exist and that I didn't just make it up?
My quick answer for that is data, especially if we can get data from students. We use a survey called My Voice at our school. It's by a guy named Russ Qualia, and it's 85 questions that students are asked on a scale. And it can be very humbling to look at the My Voice data, because this is what students are telling us about things like respect from teachers, from peers, things like are they treated differently? Does someone care when they're absent? And the data come back disaggregated in ways that you ask. So if you ask for gender disaggregation or racial ethnic disaggregation, you can get that. So data seems to help, especially when it comes out of the mouths of students. I think there's a preservation that some people have where they don't want to recognize inequity because that would mean they have to do something different. So I think there's deeper motivation for why people don't want to recognize the inequities that exist in our system.
Thank you so much, Doug. All right, some other questions. So, how can you help a peer with their own perception?
I guess it depends on what the perception is about. Easier ones, like you have low expectation, that's a little bit easier because you take the peer to see other kids who are similar and they see higher performance from a similar kind of kid. So we've done some of that in San Diego where we've taken people to look at similar schools, similar kids to see what actually third graders or ninth graders can do. So some of that. If the perception is based on like race, ethnicity, gender, that's a little harder to unpack. It takes a little bit longer. And Glenn Singleton's work says you have to have a courageous conversation, and there's a process for that. If it's something that's causing harm to the kid or the potential to cause harm, I tend to go to Jennifer Abrams' work, Having Hard Conversations, and plan out the conversation I want to have. I don't just have an impromptu conversation in that situation. Jennifer Abrams says this process where you plan out this hard conversation that you need to have so that you are ready for it when you sit down. So it's not just the spur of the moment reactionary conversation. None of those conversations about other people's perceptions are easy to have, even fairly low level ones, because our perceptions, we believe, reflect reality. And so when we're confronted with that, our reality is no longer accurate. So that's hard. Is it worth it? Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Doug. Another question. Thank you for this great opportunity. How do we change perceptions that are already established?
Yeah. There's a whole bunch of work on perceptions that starts with identifying the perception and offering alternatives. It turns out to be hard to change perceptions in the absence of kind of these aha moments and people do have them, but it's hard to get those aha moments to happen where like, I didn't know that was what I was thinking. We use an equity index, a self-assessment tool, and one of the questions on it is about white privilege. And it is very hard for people to answer that question honestly. And when we interview people months later on their experience with that, they all talk about how humbling it was to have to respond to white privilege. Whether they're white or not, they have to answer that question. And so that helps their perspective change. And it's not always comfortable, especially when they're firmly established, but there are tools out there that help with this.
Thank you. Another question is, let's see, through this program, do teachers learn how to recognize their own biases and then how to address them?
So I'm not sure which program we're talking about. Through our work on equity-driven leadership, yes, we start with what are your own biases, prejudice, perspectives, framings of the world, and how do you work through those? It's a journey for all of us to continue. I mean, we all have biases. We have to confront them. Some people are more biased than others. Some people are discriminatory and racist, or classist, as you were asking me earlier about, or sexist. We have those, and we have to be aware of them and we have to be aware that they are influencing our decisions. I'll ask the question again, Rachel. I was thinking about all these different ways people are horrible to others. Tell me the question again.
That's okay. Now, the question was, through this program, do teachers learn how to recognize their own biases and then how to address them?
So yeah, so the question is the program. So I think, so if you look at like Sanford Harmony's work, if you engage in meet up and buddy up with your class, you will start to recognize some of your biases and perspectives, but not as direct and blatantly about things like race, unless you go through something like courageous conversations. I mean, it depends on what bias we're talking about and which program we're talking about, I guess.
Thank you, Doug. Another question is, how can we get the equity index tool?
Send me an email and I will send you the equity index. So you'll put my email up at the end, Rachel?
I don't think we have your email on the slides, but we will send it in follow-up email.
Why don't I fix that?
All right. Perfect.
There we go. It's dfisher@stsu.edu. And
Thank
just
you
say
so
that
much.
you want the equity index, and I will hit reply and send it to you.
Perfect. Another question is, this is more of a clarifying question. What is the question that you spoke about regarding response to white privilege?
It's on the equity index, and it talks about the way you experience the world, and does white privilege play a role in your success or something like that. I don't have the exact question down, and first people have to ask some people have to ask what white privilege is, what we mean by that, because in many cases it's so obvious that it becomes like water to a fish. But we ask people to reflect on the role that white privilege has played in their success, their experiences. And at the beginning, people say, no, it's not. It's because I'm talented. It's because I've achieved all of these things. And then we start talking about, well, how did you achieve those? What opportunities were you given? Why were you given those opportunities? So it takes some time to understand that.
Thank you.
We have like a little saying that, and I'm cautious about saying this, but I'll say, one of the things we say to people as they go through this process is, it doesn't mean your life isn't hard. It's just not hard because of your race. That's white privilege. And some people, like, I grew up poor, I did this, and it doesn't mean your life isn't hard. It's just not hard because of your race or ethnicity. And I don't want to discount that there are formative experiences that we all have that shape and doesn't mean our life isn't hard. But that specific question, unlike that, and there are other questions, that specific question is trying to get at the privilege because of the tone of your skin.
Thank you, Doug. All right, another question is, when working on school climate, how do you address equity when the inequities are embedded in the climate and behaviors are part of the whole school design and practices?
Yeah.
kind of a two-part. How do you guide outside observers and coaches to begin the courageous conversations?
Yeah. And these are climate and culture are super hard. If those are not growing and solid, you're going to have all kinds of inequities anyway. That's harder. There are tools, not at my fingertips right now, but there are tools around school climate, like the openness of a school by Hoy. There are climate surveys, but climate is created by the people who work there and the actions they take and the decisions they make. And so you're asking a very big question, because you're not going to change it instantly. And at the same time, it's very fragile. So climate's not going to suddenly become positive right away, but a bad thing happening can change the climate dramatically. And I think a lot of people have ignored the climate stuff. So I'm not answering really clearly. We've done a lot of work on climate over the years. We did a book called Creating a Culture of Achievement. It's all about climates in schools and how you set your vision, your North Star, your pillars to get there. But it's hard work. And you can tell the climate when you walk on within 5 minutes of a building. You can feel the climate of a school.
Perfect. Thank you, Doug. Another question is, can you elaborate on how the Stanford Harmony curriculum helps with things such as equity?
Sure. So I think social emotional learning is in the journey. If you don't have that, it's hard to provide good opportunities to learn. It's hard to get to the level of instructional outcomes. So we think social emotional learning is the second rung on the taxonomy toward equity. And that as kids, to become inspired and engaged and successful, they need social emotional learning experiences integrated into their life. And the example of Stanford Harmony is very specific experiences that kids can have, especially with Meetup and Buddy Up. And there's others in the elementary. There's a much larger toolkit for elementary for social emotional development. But for middle school and high school, we use Buddy Up and Meetup because it hones their social skills and it hones their awareness of those skills, where we name skills right in the Buddy Up and Meetup process that students need to be aware of. The other part of that is, by implementing Buddy Up and Meetup Stanford Harmony processes, teachers become aware that social emotional learning is important, and they start to address social emotional learning in the lessons they teach beyond Buddy Up and Meetup. Like I said earlier, it is common practice now that when you are reading a book to kids, or kids are reading in a book club, you notice those social emotional aspects of the characters in that book. We didn't do that before. We talk about their emotional state. Are they regulating their emotions and cognition? And we talk about this now as a way to get students to then project and see what happens when you have poor or strong emotional regulation, as an example, or how this character developed strong agency, and how you might take those lessons learned from that character and develop your own agency.
Thank you, Doug. All right, we have time for a couple more questions. If you guys, if anyone has some last minute questions, I'd get them in now. Okay, another question is, how can you manage a wrong perception of your peers when you achieve so many things such as certifications and they don't, even when you try to include them?
Yeah. Gosh. I keep going back, it's these courageous conversations and using data. That's how we confront perceptions. It's got to be talked about in a healthy way, not in a blaming victim way, and it's got to be with some evidence, because we have a reflection bias, all of us do. We look for evidence that confirms what we already believe. So getting people to reflect is really very hard. So data does it, honest conversations, courageous conversations does it. but it's not simple. We're pretty resistive to changing our perceptions. And by the way, perceptions help us. I mean, more positive perceptions help us understand and make sense of the world. And we all agree to drive on a certain side of the road. That's, perceptions. I mean, that's not a rule in nature, but maybe that's not a great example, but that's what I'm looking out the window and seeing cars drive by. It's an agreement. It's a way we view the world. And if we didn't do it that way, we'd all crash into each other all the time.
Thank you. Next question is, what can we do when diversity affects equity?
Well, I would go through the taxonomy and figure out where it is. My guess, it's its opportunity to learn. That would be my guess based on the question, is that certain students are not provided equitable opportunities to learn and thus are not able to take advantage from the instructional experiences they're being provided. But I'd have to have a little bit more data to defend that answer. But I suspect it would be in compensatory and adaptive educational experiences, which we call opportunity to learn.
Thank you, Doug. Arnett, I think this person just needs some clarification. She was quoting you earlier. SEL is the second rung on the ladder of equity. What is the first rung?
Physical integration. So it's if you can't get kids in class with other kids in an integrated way, I'm not sure we'll ever get to equity. And I know we've had racial integration in this country. And someone asked earlier about socioeconomic status. There's actually better evidence that we should integrate schools based on socioeconomic status rather than race and ethnicity. That when poor kids are mixed around with middle-class kids, achievement is actually better. But we don't see a lot of integration with social class. We see mostly around race, or some places where there's no integration at all. And I'm not saying we just bust kids around, but I'm seeing within schools, if you look within schools, there are kids who sit together in the cafeteria because they are all fill in the blank and nobody else that's not that sits with them. So the idea that you're around other people who might be different from you and who might be similar to you, that physical integration becomes really important so you understand and value differences and you strive towards equity.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, this is our last question. At what grade would you start doing the equity survey?
With students, the equity audit is for administrators and teachers to use to determine where the gaps are. So I would do that at any grade. We have elementary schools working on equity audits. We have high schools doing it, community colleges doing it. But for student surveys, I think that, well, people have done it in the kindergarten classrooms, just they don't, the questions they ask are different than if you ask 7th graders. But I think the majority of places would start saying around student voice kinds of things around these issues, starting around 5th grade.
Thank you so much, Doug. That is all the time we have for questions today. And I just wanted to leave you all with a couple of announcements. A lot of people have asked if we will be sharing the slides. We won't be sharing the slides, but we will be sharing a recording of the webinar. So please stay tuned for that in probably about 24 to 48 hours. If some of your colleagues didn't get a chance to join us today, they can watch our recorded webinar. And actually, if you are interested in watching any past recorded webinars, if you go to YouTube and type in Sanford Harmony, you can visit our YouTube page that has a list of all of our past webinars, and this webinar will be posted there as well. If you are interested in our program and would like to get started, or at least would like to speak to someone about it, there's our contact information listed on our screen, their number, our direct number, and our email line. Lastly, I just want to thank Doug Fisher for such an amazing webinar and for taking the time to answer your many questions. We are so excited to have you here with us today, Doug.
Thank you.
Do you have any last comments for our audience?
No, I hope you found some kernel that you could use that helped you think about the role that social emotional learning could play in achieving the promise of equity in our schools.
Perfect. Thank you. A lot of people are thanking you in the chat box right now, saying it
Thank
was a
you.
fantastic webinar. They really appreciate you being here. And also, just as a quick reminder, when this webinar closes, our survey will launch. It's a very short survey, shouldn't take you more than a minute. We really, really appreciate your feedback. We take your feedback seriously, and it really helps us build better webinars for you in the future. And of course, it helped us build Doug's webinar today. So
Yes.
thank you all. Yes, thank you all so much for your time. Thank you, Doug, for your time. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Our next one is October 10th? 16th. And that one will be on mindfulness and social emotional learning. And with that, I will let you all go. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Doug.
Bye.